Welcome. This is the first run at the Chair's lecture series. Therefore, the Chair is giving the inaugural lecture a go. This may turn out to be one of the great disasters of my professional career as Chair. I don't really know. Either way, from here on in, we're going to try and sample from amongst you lot as this continues to build, with, of course, the idea that we'll find a way to develop a little bit of departmental familiarity, maybe a little bit of a social culture, introduce people to what we actually all do. I don't think we've got our lineup set yet for the rest of this fall and winter term, but I've already warned the brand new hires that in order to reintroduce themselves to the department, that they are on tap for the next 3 to 4 Chair's Lecture Series opportunities. Either way, I'm really hoping that this is more fun than some sort of dull, dry, boring lecture, at least coming from me. I'm sure it'll be a lot more stimulating, young and forward thinking coming from the likes of Dr. Spreebola, Urig. We've got Corwin Sullivan here as well. I don't see Kim Mathote yet. Actually, I think she had to say no thank you. And of course, a number of you are teaching, which means I think we had about 30 today. Is that about right?
31, actually.
Yep. We've tried, maybe the booze at the afternoon party format won't work. I can't understand why it wouldn't. I hope it does. Nevertheless, I'm kind of imagining today what I'm going to do is lead you through what I've been doing in a very general sort of way for the last 17 years since I've been here in the department. I don't want me to just stand up here and talk. If there's an idea, a question, or something that occurs to you, I hope we can turn this into a conversational half hour, 45 minutes, rather than just me alone in front of the video camera. So either way, here's number one. And I ran it past the executive as to whether or not I should be drinking while lecturing. I've gone with the option of just plain old water. Whether or not that'll make any difference in what comes out of my mouth or not, I have no clue. It might actually have been better had I gone for the drinking option. But either way, what I thought I'd do today to throw this inaugural party is to introduce you to a little bit about what I know and what I've been doing with respect to one aspect of my research program, which concerns the evolution, origin, interrelationships, phylogeny, et cetera, regarding the history and evolution of snakes. And of course, I thought I'd start right from the ground up. And that actually, maybe it's a wee bit too bright, isn't it? I went for some white font, and maybe I shouldn't have. That's probably a little bit better, huh? Now, I know everyone in the room is a biologist. I see John Holmes here. He spent a lot of time looking at parasites in snakes. We have a lot of them upstairs in our zoology collection. Everybody in this room knows what a snake is. You've all gone through a basic biological education. You'd be surprised how many times, though, people confuse it, and I'll explain some of that here in a second. But the question that we really face when we're asking a question about the origins, interrelationships, and phylogeny of snakes is, what was a snake like before it was a snake? And you can phrase that in very simple terms, but it is actually a deep and meaningful academic question, because they had to come from somewhere, which means what they look like now isn't what they've always looked like. And this is not a trivial task when you're looking at the fossil record in order to try and understand, interpret, discover, recover that ancestral snake. What is that primitive snake? What does that thing actually look like? So we've got to rethink what we think a snake is. The extant forms, the nearly 4,000 living species of snakes, are pretty straightforward and clear. They've got a head with big teeth on one end for the most part, and the bit behind that is extremely long and skinny. But they can't always have been that way unless they were, of course, divinely created. Everyone in this room is pretty sure that's not what I'm about to argue. And you're quite correct. So that instead, we're talking about taking that great 14th century painting of the four-legged snake, Satan, who was made limbless and turned into a snake for his sin of tempting Eve to eat the apple. We take that snake and we realize that at some point in its evolutionary past, it likely had four limbs. Now, we know from the anatomy of extant snakes that while they may not have a remnant of the pectoral girdle and forelimb, they definitely have remnants, particularly in the lower groups of snakes, of the pelvic girdle and even remnants of the femur. Those are present in a boa, a python, and a handful of other basal extant snakes. So we know for sure they were once four-legged critters. In other words, snakes are lizards in every sense of the word, and that little color didn't turn out very well at all. In this particular phylogenetic diagram, a recent contribution by Todd Reeder and company from 2016, using molecules and morphology to produce this phylogenetic hypothesis. Snakes are lizards. They're nested firmly within this group called squamates. Essentially, squamata and lacertilia are synonyms. Lizards are four-legged, scaly, special kind of tongued reptiles, of which snakes are a highly derived member that have lost their limbs over their evolutionary history. So they're lizards. But this also means at some point in their evolutionary past, they had four legs. Now, that four-legged snake is still elusive with respect to the fossil record. We haven't found one yet. There was a recent description a couple of years ago suggesting that a four-legged snake had been found in the rock record, but unfortunately that specimen is not the remains of a snake, potentially something closely related, but still not a snake. And if snakes are a derived kind of lizard and they're characterized by being long and skinny, when we look at the rest of the other 6,000 and some species of living lizards, we also find a remarkable number of them are elongate, skinny, and legless. The way that we recognize these different groups of non-snake, elongate, skinny lizards is, as being separate from snakes, is around the features of the skull. So these are the anatomical characteristics that we use to differentiate them. And I'll show a few of those in more detail to you shortly. So that's kind of what we know. They're lizards. At one point in the past, they had to have had four legs. There are lots of other examples among extant squamata of limbless and elongate-bodied lizards that are not snakes, which means being elongate and limbless isn't unique to snakes. Now, that's not really that well known, but this does give us a bit of a problem in placing the evolutionary relationships, defining the phylogenetic relationships of snakes in lizards. Likely it happened an extremely long time ago, not a few million years ago, not 100 million years ago, but probably a 200 million year old event. The rock record is slowly producing more information on that, but this leaves us with the problem of defining what makes a snake a primitive snake. So we'll take a look for a second at extant groups of snakes and lizards, just to introduce these to you. Amongst the extant forms of what we conventionally call snake lizards, we have all of these things which most everyone in the room is quite familiar with. Pythons, rattlesnakes, local garter snakes. We've got an anilioid snake here, a cobra, and this is a rather highly derived mangrove snake. The ones that are a bit more problematic are these odd little skinny things up here. Amongst the nearly 4,000 species of snakes, almost everything is in this group right here, including the cobras. About 500 or 600 species in these more basal kinds of snakes. And around here, we've got about 500 of those extant species, restricted to this blind burrowing clade. These animals are extremely, extremely small, and they are very degenerate and highly specialized in their anatomies. Very weird skulls. They are indeed blind. Most of them are about that long, yet you still have 200 to 300 vertebrae tucked into an itty-bitty little thread-like critter known as a thread snake in an animal about that big. The skulls are at best about 10 millimeters long. They're very tiny. But they're very important because they have, as I'll show you, been synonymized with the most primitive condition in snakes for about the last 150 years. Amongst the lizards, as I said, and as you could see from that one phylogeny slide, there are a large number of extant legless, and I mean completely legless, and broadly speaking, distantly related lizard groups that have specialized around this long, skinny body form. Yet, basal members of the group are fully limbed, right down to 5 fingers, 5 toes, with very short bodies, as opposed to the incredibly elongate kind, like you can see with this legless skink illustrated above. You get every possible body form amongst non-snake elongate lizards. They're out there. How do you tell the difference? The difference is in the head. It's not the similarities of body form, nor the behavior and function that results when you are elongate and limbless. Instead, you can take the head of that animal and you know immediately that it's a legless teid within the gymnophthalmid group, or the same thing for one of these legless geckos, nested within this clade of typical terrarium geckos, and the same thing for the skinks, the anguids. There are a couple of exceptions amongst the amphisbaenids and dibamids, but again, limblessness is easy to come by. Fossil snakes. Now, this is the fun paleo part of the story. In the last few years, I've been working on some very fragmentary remains, but remains that nonetheless are most certainly those of some of the most ancient snakes that we have a fossil record of. Interestingly, the material has come from rocks about 160 to 140 million years old, distributed across what was then known as Laurasia, back in the uppermost Jurassic and the lowermost part of the Cretaceous periods. So this particular radiation of most ancient snakes comes from the northern hemisphere a very long time ago. But importantly, they're actually found in reasonably marginal aquatic environments, with the exception of the Morrison Formation here from Colorado and Utah. But this allowed us, within the last couple of 3 years, to push back the fossil record of snakeness here into a much earlier period of time than had ever been anticipated. The next best part of the fossil record of snakes, so I'm kind of trying to build the data set for you, extant organisms and what we know of snake evolution from the fossil record. The next best part of the rock record, or the data set rather, of fossil snakes comes from marine deposited rocks in the Middle East and the circum-Mediterranean. Those of you who know a little bit about my, my annual travel habits know that I am periodically, no, let me rephrase that, constantly somewhere in the Mediterranean, whether it's in Israel, Croatia, Italy, southern France, maybe other parts of North Africa, and you'll probably know that that coincides with the world's great food and wine producing regions. I want you to know it's because there is actually a unique data set that comes from these rocks, and even though the rocks that these critters are preserved in make the best rocks for the best vines in the world, that's just happenstance. It may keep me going back, but it's happy happenstance. Either way, these marine deposited sediments are also spectacular places for remarkable preservation. So you can see we've got a really beautiful collection from these 95 million year old rocks in these marine deposited systems, a really beautiful collection of perfectly laid out snakes. Some of them even retain soft body details. What's really important about this material is that right in here, it's not very visible in this photograph, you can find extremely well preserved rear limbs, right down to the presence of 2 tiny little toes. Admittedly, the legs are small, but they're actually extending beyond the body wall, and they really still had legs at this point in time. There's no evidence of forelimbs. This appears to be way past that point in time. when snakes had lost their forelimbs, at least in this lineage of somewhat closely related marine snakes from this Tethyan Ocean region of southern Europe, North Africa, 95 to 100 million years ago. But really beautiful material. Another new piece of the record, which is currently in review, this really interesting little brain case comes from the lowermost Cretaceous, so about 140 million years ago or so, lowermost Cretaceous of southern Gondwana, down here in what is now South Africa. And this is a really cool little brain case because it's preserved in 3 dimensions and is the earliest known brain case of a particular radiation of snakes, quite a bit different than those Jurassic bits and pieces I showed you a slide or two ago, and remarkably different than the material from the Mediterranean region and that marine group of snakes. They're up here in and around this point in time, whereas this skull is the first representative of a mostly extinct group of snakes represented today only by 1 or 2 different genera in South America, Southeast Asia, and India. So it's a rather relictual Gondwanan distribution of an early and unsuspected radiation of snakes. And this one was described in 1999, but not given a name, nor was it recognized as a snake by one of our own former master's students, a previous student of Dr. Fox, sitting on the back row by Andy Keddy, a fellow by the name of Hans-Dieter Seuss. Anyways, that description will shortly be out, or redescription, recognizing it as a snake. Another extremely important place for snake material is South America right now. And I've been doing quite a bit of field work in the last few years. Not just, and sorry, this is not too terribly informative. The Santonian Campanian is a stage, or a couple of stages in the Upper Cretaceous, taking us back to about the 85 to 80 million year old rock time. This is an extremely well preserved snake. It was, the first skull was found in found before 1901, but described in 1901. And then nothing else ever was known of the animal until the early 2000s, when I got access to a recent Argentinian collection and we started publishing on this material. A really big-bodied snake, big head. The animal would have been about 2 meters long, so a good-sized snake with a skull roughly like so. Aeolian environments, so big open sand dunes, seasonally wet, and probably eating small mammals, reptiles, dinosaurs in the lot. They're very common in the rocks with this animal. But again, this guy is part of this same radiation, including the South African thing that I was talking about a moment ago. And the newest locality we've been working, this is even older rocks, so the Tyrolean in Argentina takes us back 90 million years. You can see beautifully articulated specimens in this particular case, an animal named Najash rionegrina. And what's really cool, this is not a marine snake, it's a terrestrial critter. Again, a very dry aeolian environment. We find the articulated ones dead and preserved on the slip faces of sand dune systems. And the disarticulated material, broken up by current, wind, and rain, we find down in the seasonal washes as environments were changing on a regular basis around seasonal flooding. But what's neat about this animal is you can see an extremely long femur right here. This is the ilium. This is part of the ischium. And then the tibia is broken off here. We have new specimens of this animal. This thing would have been about 2 meters long in some of the biggest ones, and they've got huge hips and rear limbs, so that these legs were actually large. Again, no evidence of forelimbs at all. And we're getting lots and lots of material. Here's another absolutely beautiful specimen. You can see the animal is quite coiled up on itself, twisted around, and the skull is coming out towards the top of the frame. Absolutely beautiful material. But again, no forelimbs. So we're still at a stage in snake evolution at 90 to 100 million years ago where in multiple lineages they're retaining rear limb systems. Why? I haven't got a clue. They just did. but they've already gone through as a collective, regardless of whether they're isolated in Gondwana or up in Laurasia in the northern hemisphere or living in the oceans, where they've already lost complete evidence or totally lost any evidence whatsoever of the pectoral girdle and forelimbs. Some really interesting evo-devo stuff going on at this stage in snake evolution. So we're going to find out what the primitive snake's about. We've got to go back in time yet into older rocks to try and identify that four-legged critter. And of course, as you can probably imagine, you're left with questions like, what did the head look like in that animal? Now, I'll get to that head question in a second, but I just wanted to show you again how beautiful some of this material is, down to the point where they're three-dimensionally preserved. And these things we're collecting in Argentina. Here's the orbit right there, the lower jaw, the front of the snout. The skull is complete in 3 dimensions. You can actually look at brain case details in micro CT scan imaging. Jaws are articulated, and Dr. Fox might find this particular detail riveting, as may Corwin Sullivan. There is a perfectly preserved jugal in exactly the position below the orbit where you would expect to find it in articulation with the ectopterygoid. And it's always fun to say all those words in connection. But this is particularly relevant because this element has been thought to have been lost through snake evolution and is no longer present in extant snakes. In fact, it is actually there, and it's the element that's always been referred to as the postorbital, but it's just the upper part in an extant snake. The rest of it, which signifies what it is based on topology, is preserved in some of these older specimens in irrefutable ways, I guess would be the best way to put it. Which, when we put it all together, allows us access to unparalleled information on brain case evolution. And if you think back to the image I was showing you at the start of the presentation, with the legless lizards, all have a long skinny body, but they are identifiable based on their cranial anatomy for the kind of lizard that they are. The new additions to the fossil record of snakes, particularly this Gondwanan lineage preserved in 3 dimensions from South Africa through to South America, gives us unparalleled access to the anatomy of the brain case. We can micro CT scan these things and gain access to the inside of the brain cases in ways that we couldn't in the past. And I'm not going to take you through the details of this. It's a particular issue regarding a charmingly complex portion of the otic capsule called the crista circumfenestralis. But either way, this is the kind of information that we're able to retrieve now, giving us a very clear signal about some ancient clade events, cladogenic events, going on in Gondwana as opposed to Laurasia, which, if you're familiar with some of the Pangea and the breakup of Pangea towards the early part of the Triassic period, where we end up with the separation, the vicariant separation of these early groups of reptiles, some of them staying in the southern hemisphere on Gondwanan continents, South America, Australia, India, Africa, and the rest being isolated on northern continents. And again, the thing that we're only beginning to get some sense of understanding on is what happens with these marine forms through snake evolution. Being elongate and skinny, regardless of how you got there, means that you're also a pretty good swimmer. And we can imagine that, like modern sea snakes, where you find them pan-Pacific in some cases, that the marine environment and coastlines were probably extremely easy migration and movement routes for these early groups of snake-bodied animals, regardless of their Gondwanan or Laurasian ancestry, to make their way repeatedly around the world, way back when. Similar models emerging for what we currently understand about the evolution of marine turtles. It hasn't been one radiation over a couple of 100 million years, but multiple radiations of different lineages of seagoing turtles. Oh, and a cute... I borrowed some of these slides from other talks, so I apologize if a few animations pop up. But this takes us back to the head and body thing. How am I doing for time?
It's 3:30.
3:30. Oh, pretty good. Usually when I give a talk at a conference, there is no way I can get done in 13 minutes. Even with 13 slides, I am the guy that gets hauled off with the cane around his neck every time. Either way, this really interesting question about snake head versus snake body. Which came first? I mean, it's honestly a chicken and egg question, but it's a relevant question, particularly when we want to go to the fossil record to see what we can find in ancient rocks that will provide us some information on this transformation. And it is an incredibly interesting transformation in the evolutionary history of squamates. I particularly like this image because they had to put the chicken feed out here as the only way they could get that chick to stare metaphysically at an egg. But either way, this is the question. So, as many of you probably endure, not everybody in your business agrees with every single paper you publish or every bright idea you think you've had. I suffer that same problem, and I know you find this shocking. But Nick Longrich, Jacques Gauthier and company published a paper in 2012 where they argued that the snake body came before the snake head. Now, I can find no reason, either by data or by analogy, to accept that. The evidence simply from extant lizards would lead me to think quite the contrary, where it's easy to become skinny, it's easy to lose your legs, developmentally, maybe complex, but it's still easy, or it wouldn't happen so frequently. Yet, they're identifiable as the kind of lizard they are, gecko, anguid, whatever it might be, because they still retain the characteristic architecture of that lineage's cranial history. Done. The same thing should hold true for snakes. They're just one kind of long, skinny lizard. That's all they are. But at some point in their evolutionary history, and we can track those cranial features back to the middle to upper part of the Jurassic, so 160 million to 170 million years ago now, those are identifiable as snake head bits, and they are fragmentary, which is deeply frustrating. But either way, they're identifiable as snake head bits because they retain those features that still characterize modern snakes and that characterize subsequent lineages of things that are obviously snakes as well between 170 million years ago and the present. Snake body evolved first? I don't think so. I think instead, because that would be the argument if it did, keeps a lizard head and gets a long skinny body, well, that would mean it's just a varanid lizard with a long skinny body. Instead, it's this kind of thing. And so this is the search image that we're using in the Caldwell lab, and amongst myself and my collaborators in hunting up what we should be looking to find when we're pulling museum drawers open or banging rocks in Argentina or South Africa or other places in the world where we can get to rock units of the appropriate kind and age to give us some opportunity to try and find that early snake, which is functionally and behaviorally and adaptively moving its skull in this direction towards snakeness, while at the same time its postcranial skeleton is still retaining features that connect it to all the other lizards in the group that it evolved from within. It's a challenge, and it's not happening quickly. And just to reiterate, that's the analogy argument against the extant fauna. I can see this was a redundant slide. We'll just work our way through redundancy for a second. And what are we up against? One of the things that I really enjoy is what I like to refer to as historical burden. I'm sure I've ripped that idea off of somebody else. But either way, none of us come into our business an infant, intellectually speaking. We are introduced to the literature of our subdiscipline. We read it, we absorb it. We also have the advantage of being where we are in time and space intellectually, as in the here and now. We're not in the 1890s, even if we go back to the 1890s literature. In the 1890s, all they had was everything leading up to 1890 or 1889. What do we take with us? Well, this great man, and I have to admit, his clever ideas are still the ones I find myself cleverly attached to. But Ed Cope, 1869, proposed, based on anatomy, not on what he presumed to be an evolutionary trajectory of any kind, but on anatomy, that snakes and a fossil group of giant seagoing lizards, the mosasaurs, were more closely related to each other than to lizards. He wrote that literally a year after Huxley and Seeley had first proposed, 1868, that birds might actually be dinosaurs, which, as we are now aware, is probably true. They got themselves in a bucket of hot water over that one for a long period of time, until the fossil record produced enough information on feathered dinosaurs to make it clear there was very much a real phylogenetic relationship. Ed Cope, when he wrote his paper, immediately, like the lobster, was thrown into a pot of boiling water or was sitting in the pot of boiling water and the heat was slowly turned up. Either way, he entered a world of pain with just about every other squamate worker and paleontologist at the time. Richard Owen over here said, nope, Ed's insane. Mosasaurs are varanids, dolichosaurs are probably snake ancestors. O.C. Marsh, who was in a battle with Ed Cope over a number of things like the plesiosaur and CCIS and which end the head should go on. And that's a real story, look it up. O.C. Marsh would have said no to Ed Cope's idea just because it was Ed Cope's idea. But either way, he said mosasaurs are varanids, they have nothing to do with snakes, but he provided no suggestion whatsoever on the evolution, phylogeny, and origins of snakes. This takes us out of the 18th century into the early part of the 20th century. And as you can see, I'm telling you a story driven by paleontologists. These are people who are actually working on the rock record. This very colorful character, a Hungarian nobleman, Baron Franz Nopcsa, he liked to dress up like this and ride a motorcycle around south-central Europe until he actually used that gun on himself, which is a sad story. But either way, he was very explicit about it. He took it beyond mosasaurs and actually considered that a mosasaur group of relatives could be implicated, based on his studies of anatomy, in the origins and ancestry of snakes. A couple of people argued against him at this point in time, again paleontologists, and this fellow Janich described a 50-million-year-old snake from northern Italy, and the argument he used was one of analogy again to the modern fauna, where he said, if you look at living snakes, like lizards, they're exclusively land animals. And we must therefore assume that their predecessors gained their body form on the land and not in the water. And so the arguments start to mount about what is and is not primitive and what the evolution and origins of snakes could have been all about. And it's roughly about the same time that Nopcsa dies that the entire data set moves away from the fossil record. There were no new snake specimens popping up in the early part of the 20th century, and the neontological or non-paleontological herpetology crowd took over and started examining in detail, following very much that 19th century German school approach, began examining in detail the soft tissue features of living snakes and lizards in order to try and see what could be gleaned in terms of data from that data set. The conclusion was that the blind burrowing snakes, those little thread snakes I showed you at the start, that particular group, the worm-like forms, could well indeed have been the first snake. Now, to go back ever so slightly to this other slide, this was the detail in Walls's monograph on reptilian eyes. This is the detail of the eye of one of those blind burrowing snakes. And for anybody familiar with retinal structure and the organization of the vertebrate eye, you'll recognize that this is very much a degenerate and simplified eye system. Over to the right is the eye of another lizard. No, that's another snake again, sorry. Typhlops gemmicensis. These are both blind and burrowing. This is an amphisbaenian, and that's the snake. And what you find as you look through the retinal cells of extant snakes is that the blind burrowing scolophidians, B up at the top, they have a particular kind of rod cell but no cones. So in other words, they don't see, well, they don't see at all because they have skin completely covering the eye. But the idea then in looking at higher groups of snakes is that the cones that are there are actually specialized rod forms, not proper lizard cones. And the argument starts to build in the 1940s that not only is Typhlops, or the blind burrowing forms, the primitive snake morph, but that all of the other features of large-bodied above-ground snakes, like a python, or a rattlesnake, or a garter snake, or the modern elapids, sea snakes, you pick it, are re-elaborations or re-evolution, quote, from a degenerate form that itself evolved underground. Now, if this is the case, then the argument I've been making about a big-bodied, four-legged, terrestrial kind of ancestor with a snake head is moot, because we're talking about snakeness as a re-elaboration of a degenerate system, a simplified system. This is the historical and intellectual burden in the subdiscipline in which I work. A little bit of insight was provided as we moved from the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, where Garth Underwood was trying to draw a distinction between simplification and degeneration and the relationship of those two to what is or could not be primitive. So it starts to change a little bit. But I'll explore this scolophidian thing. Back to the thread snakes ever so slightly, and I want to show you what they look like. Now here's a little metaphor I try to use on my herpetology colleagues all the time. We have some mammal people in this room. I see Jan Muri smiling. The argument being made in herpetological circles about the evolution of snakes from blind burrowing forms and that everything else is a re-elaboration would be like trying to convince Jan or Colleen that this is the primitive rodent and that everything else that's rodenty is a re-evolution or re-elaboration of this condition. There is no mammal worker on the planet who would buy that argument. But amongst paleontologists and herpetologists concerned about the evolution of snakes, we still suffer this problem. I'm not kidding. We genuinely do. It's barely starting to go away now. But to give you an idea, this is the problem with these things. These little thread snakes, these little flowerpot snakes, have got unusually bizarre skulls. The postcranium, not so much. It's a long, little, skinny, itty-bitty thing, and it really isn't remarkably different from the postcranium of a typical snake. But the skull is extremely hard to compare to that of an extant snake, or I'm sorry, to that of any snake from that other group, the Alithinophidians. So here on the top, I'm not sure I've fired this thing up. Ah. Wow, yeah, everybody can see that at the back, can't they? If you were a cat, this would not even be interesting. I'm going to skip that. Either way, you can see that is a leptotyphlopid skull at the top. Underneath it is the skull of this thing I've been working on from Argentina, Denalicia. This is a typical python skull. Now you can see the problem immediately. That thing is bizarre. The face is all scrunched up, it's blind, the eye is just a little blob on the end of the optic nerve, covered up by a scale right up under that thing that says palatine up at the top. It's got a very tiny jaw. I'll try this thing. It's got a very, very tiny maxilla with no teeth. The dentary is all crunched up into this very, very small element, a couple of teeth at the front. The nose is huge, mostly because they really do burrow. They live around termite mounds and ant mounds and hunt for larvae for the most part. They're good egg stealers. The quadrate is an elongate element that shoves the whole jaw forward, and the rest of the skull is very long and quite solidly constructed, even though the bone, because it's so small, is as thin as eggshell. And the rest of these skulls just simply don't compare. Here's a typical, well, not so typical lizard in this case, but imagine this is pretty much the standard construction of your average lizard skull. Pythons, these 85 million year old things from South America, these all compare well. These are space alien implants into the data set on snake evolution that create some severe problems. It isn't until you spend your time looking at the 3,500 some odd higher groups of snakes, the colubroids. So here we have an atractaspid, a kind of snake nested within the viperid radiation. This one's a little bit of a blindo itself, a highly specialized viper, but you can begin to see the similarities in the construction of the skull. In vipers, rattlesnakes, that lot, they all have a mobile maxilla, so they can bend that fang back into the mouth and get the tooth out of the way. Otherwise, it'd be, well, you can imagine, sort of bad news for a snake. You look like a saber-toothed cat. But our little friend Typhlops up here does exactly the same thing. You can see the maxilla is unhinged from the prefrontal, the bone that should be in front of where the eye would normally be here. There are a couple of teeth on the end of this thing, and this thing is hinged backwards and tucked. I don't know why they use this to sneak up on termite eggs, but either way, that's what they do. The jaw is extremely elongate in this post-dentary complex, the compound system as it is in here. The dentary is very reduced, again a reduced dentary. We begin to see that there is organization in this skull amongst these little blind burrowing things that's very, very similar to the organization of the cranium in higher groups of snakes, but extremely high groups of snakes, which, if we were to just use the rodent example as a metaphor, makes sense. If you're going to reduce this down to something, you're going to reduce it down, but still retain features of the ancestral form that you came from. And it's much easier to find those similarities here as opposed to here. And there are all kinds of other features. That Christocircumfenestralis thing I was talking about, the organization of the otic capsule here and here, they're identical. They're not like that in a python or boa, and they're definitely not like that in the Gondwanan radiation of snakes from the lowermost part of the Cretaceous and into the Cretaceous that we've been working on. And this is an argument we tried to make, myself and my collaborator Mike Lee, and we're now in the habit, this is literally 20 years ago, 1997. It's an argument we've been making for a long time. We weren't trying to argue that these were the most primitive snakes, but rather that these blind burrowing things, the Scolophidians right here, were actually extremely derived snakes. Their position as the primitive burrowing morph, that historical burden, was in fact the problem that we were dealing with in terms of assessing anatomy and molecules, et cetera, and the fossil record in understanding something meaningful about the evolutionary history of snakes. This caused a great debate because we argued that these guys were, well, this diagram makes it look like we argued these guys were primitive, but in fact, this was the major intellectual move made in this paper and the one that we've been pursuing ever since. Where are we today? Well, if we're working on the evolution of snakes, you may have seen yesterday in Biology Letters, a new paper was released, 4,178 loci, 1.5 million base pairs, 32 taxa, and the problem solved. I'll show you the paper in a second. It literally says that in the title. But either way, if you're working on the problem, you've got a two-stage question to ask. Where do snakes fit in the evolutionary radiation of lizards? That's question number one. In this big picture story, somewhere up here. The second question you have to ask is, what are the in-group relationships of Serpentes? How do the known fossil and extant forms relate to each other? All of this, of course, requires, in its perfect form, a great deal of data. Today, we have the added advantage of being able to look at 4,100 some odd loci and 1.5 million base pairs, whereas in the past, we couldn't do that. We also have the advantage today of a much expanding fossil record, which gives us dates and times and locations, both in time and space, and most importantly, provides us extremely important information on those ancient anatomies. If in fact Scolopithecians do belong up here, and if in fact this information does bear on the ancestral morphologies, the ancient anatomies of snakes, then we are making some progress, I think, in beginning to address and answer these questions on just what we think we might know. I'll just highlight all of that. Oh, what's the time? 3:50? All right, I'll cut it off. I'll go to the finished slide. The snakehead likely evolved first. Yay! And this is the paper that just came out yesterday. If you want to do a little bit more reading, it's a place to go too. I don't think we've resolved the origin of snakes with 1.5 million base pairs either. And these guys skipped morphology altogether. But the paper makes some outlandish claims. It's good reading. And I hope that for the chair's lecture series, I've shown you a little bit about what I do, and maybe we can have another glass of wine.
Hi, what would Raymond Hoser of Australia make of your last little thing? Yeah, he's going to take that and generate a whole bunch of names.
Jackson.
Yep. Doug's talking about
The rogue taxonomist.
the rogue taxonomist, yeah, a fellow in Australia who is in the habit, I think he's actually been banned by the herp community from publishing in just about anything and everything.
How about a genus called Hoserae after himself in his own journal?
Ray Hoser will have fun with this, Doug. Yep. Dr. Fox.
We made mention of leptotyphloids,
Yes.
and their distribution presently is very interesting in Western Asia, North and South America, Africa, and that's probably a vicariant distribution, not a distribution owing to dispersal, which would put the history of that group well prior to the known fossil record. To account, you really have to go back to the breakup of Pangea.
Yep. And I think, no, let me go this way. I'll take us back to a couple of maps. How far do I have to go back? Yeah, and I honestly am of the opinion that that's where we need to go to, Dick. We can just start there. This is 145 million years ago. At the moment, I'm content that we've identified a couple of major snake clades that were unrecognized to this point, a Laurasian distributed one and a Gondwanan. I suspect it's more than that, and I'm also extremely suspicious that this is an Upper Permian diversification and radiation of squamates, which means we're still nearly 60 to 80 million years out on the rock record in terms of...
I just wonder whether there might be a parallel, excuse me for mentioning this, with mammals.
Oh, yes.
Modern monotremes
Yes.
are highly derived, highly specialized, and yet they're the most primitive of living mammals.
Indeed. And I think this is one of the problems we've suffered from on the snake and lizard side. It's been clear because monotremes are furry and lay eggs, if I can simplify it that much, that extant mammals still represent a part of their evolutionary history in a way that we can't sample this data set, the extant squamate snake and lizard data set. We're really dependent on the fossil record to give us that insight. And I think that's where the mistake was made in presuming that Scolopithecians represent the most primitive group of snakes. I think some of these snake lineages are extremely long-lived, and I don't think the extant forms are each other's closest relatives either, or not necessarily. And certainly the case with the scolopithecians. I don't think it's a monophyletic assemblage. I think some of them nest probably within colubroids, but leptotyphlopid distributions are definitely problematic. When Dick was talking about vicariance versus dispersal, they're referred to as flowerpot snakes, the typhlopids, for the very simple reason that they get caught up in tropical plant flower pots. They're tiny, and the next thing you know, you've got them in Florida and anywhere else that you've exported the flower pots to. They do very well in tropical habitats, and we can't track their dispersal around flower pot sales, but you get the problem. However, that isn't the case with the anomalolepidids nor the leptotyphlopids. So in fact, each of these probably has its own independent story. And I think that's slowly where we're going with what we're pulling out of the fossil record right now, is that it is a much more complex story, and potentially snakeness amongst what we're currently calling snakes may actually be as incorrect as assuming that all legless forms of lizards are also snakes. It's very possible. It's certainly true, the rock records made it very clear, true, we'll use that word carefully, the rock records made it very clear that snakes have lost their legs multiple times, at least the rear limbs. What else hasn't been lost or gained in common? This is the next question. Rich?
In the limbless non-snake lizards, is the order of limb loss the same? So are the forelimbs and pectoral girdles lost before the hind limb and pelvis?
Yep, there's only one exception. Did I keep a photograph of the exception in here? I don't think I did. No, there is one here. So amongst dibamids, skinks, geckos, the teids, the legless teids, some limb-reduced fossil forms, and the anguids, it's universal. Forelimbs are lost, and then rear limbs. There's one great group from Australia, the genus Larista, a group of skinks, about 120 known species. Within those 120 known species, there are 120 different forms of limb loss, right from toes on the front limb to no toes on the rear limb to loss of the forelimb, 5 toes on the back leg, just a spike up front, nothing on the back leg, and then completely limbless forms. Now, the one thing about Larista is none of them lose the girdles. So whatever is going on in terms of limb reduction and Hox gene, et cetera, it's not taking the girdles out of the picture. What appears to happen when you look through all of the different morphs in all of these different groups is that when you finally lose the pectoral girdle, developmentally speaking, that seems to create a developmental cascade that allows the animal to get increasingly longer between the back of the skull and the hips, so that they go from 35 to 40 vertebrae between girdle and hip to 70, 80 to 100 or more. Only when you finally shed the girdle in the rear, from the rear limb, does the entire snake start to become incredibly elongate. A modern python, a big one, 20 feet long, still only has about 250 vertebrae. But an extant viper, which has no remnant whatsoever of the pelvic girdle, could have upwards of 300 to 400. So there seems to be a signaling control in there. The exception to the rule is this goofy little thing, Bipes, and it's the only one in its group, the Amphisbaenians. If you're ever in the Baja Peninsula in Mexico, just start lifting rocks up, and you'll find these little guys curled up underneath the rocks, maybe in a shallow burrow. You can see even in this grainy image, they've got a perfectly fine forelimb. And in fact, it's hyper-developed, and they use the forelimb to assist them in digging. They're like a little mole rat with a really big shovel-shaped forelimb, huge humerus for pectoral girdle and deltoid muscle attachments, and they're extremely proficient burrowers. So they blow the rules right out of the water. And I mentioned the recent description of a Brazilian specimen that was touted as a snake with 4 legs a couple of years ago in Science. That thing also breaks the rules. It's got an incredibly large number of vertebrae between the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle, upwards of 200, but it still has a tiny pectoral girdle and very tiny forelimb, which, according to this, it shouldn't. By comparison to the patterns that we see developmentally and morphologically in the rest of Squamata, and in fact, all the other limbless or limb-reduced and elongate amphibians, whether they're lys amphibians or ancient labyrinthodonts or anthracosaurs. Yeah. Andrew.
So I teach developmental biology.
Yep.
And I, stupidly enough, give a lecture which is on snake evolution.
Yep.
Even though I know nothing about it. I know better now. One of the things we spend a lot of time on is talking about the idea of losing limbs and losing limbs. And what you're arguing is that that's actually something besides being a snake. So my question is actually just quite simple. The literature I'm aware of is entirely focused on that question, which is how do we become limbless?
Mm-hmm.
Where is that literature which is more central to your question, which is how do we change all the shapes of the head? So that seems like what people should be actually doing.
Yep.
With all of the evolutionary information, all of the sequence data that they have, but are they actually doing that?
In my experience, no. And in particular, with respect to the snake and elongation literature, the effort is still, as you say, devoted to the questions of how we lose limbs, in which order we lose limbs, which gene units are activated, in what sequence, and what patterning seems to result from that activation. So Marty Cohn's work, Cheryl Tickle, that whole crowd. I know Marty really well. We've been friends for a long time, and I know the questions that they're still asking in his lab concern elongation and limb loss. I don't really know, and this would be a question in the broad vertebrate evolution, or of broad vertebrate evolutionary consequence, any work that's being done in particular on skull evolution from the point of view that you're speaking of. I'm not familiar with it. I don't know if anybody else is. No. It'd be good.
Yeah, I agree.
Yep.
Interesting.
Sally.
So I guess it's back to the same sort of question. So you're looking for heads that might have fangs or something that indicates.
Yeah.
When you show your picture of snakes and I guess scuffle of something or other.
Scolopophidians.
What you really notice is that the shape where the head, where it would turn into a body. So in the snakes, they're very, you see a head.
Mm-hmm.
You know, heads are very differentiated. So what's going on there with the bones and the forelimb loss that there's a head? I mean, clearly, you say you don't know why you know what things do with a pair of legs way down the body, but clearly that's not something. Maybe legs get in the way. I mean, you've gone through all of this in your whole life looking at why they would have lost them.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe when you look for head, are you also looking for changes that might be going on further down?
Yeah, well, one of the things that's really obvious when when the pectoral girdle disappears, you lose that characteristic identity of the pre-pectoral girdle vertebrae, the cervical vertebrae. In snakes, what seems to happen is whatever developmental and genetic information is controlling that process with post-loss of the pectoral girdle, it seems to translate cervical character down the length of the body. And it becomes more profound as you move towards higher groups of snakes where they now begin to lose the pelvic girdle. So the skull still remains distinct, but everything seems to become cervicalized. You end up with a large number of Bony structures referred to as hypotheses, and these are leftover intercentra from a much earlier stage in vertebrate evolution. But you have intercentra that normally stop where the pectoral girdle is in a typical pectoral girdle bearing lizard, that in a snake begin to move all the way down the body and everything becomes more cervical-like until it gets to within 20 or 30 vertebrae of the cloaca, absence of the pelvic girdle notwithstanding. So that's something that happens to the postcranium. Cranial evolution, and I might be wandering way away from your question, Sally. In fact, I feel like I am an ocean away from your question, actually.
I'm curious, I mean, you think you can identify really good characteristics of the head if you guys found it in a drawer somewhere?
Sure can.
And and you think the body would look absolutely like a lizard?
Yep.
Except for that characteristic. So I'm wondering if
There-
there's something
no,
else up there
there
that's
are-
not part of the head that you're not necessarily looking for.
There are other features of the postcranial skeleton. There are details of the vertebrae that are characteristic of snakes. That much I can say. What would those vertebrae look like in an ancient snake with 4 legs? I'm not sure. I can't quite make that up, to be honest. But I have seen cranial features, skull features, jaws as well, not just the cranium. There are a large number of things that characterize a modern snake that we find in the rock record. They're there. The postcranial stuff is a little more dodgy. Yep. So I'm hoping this thing really looks like it's just about to lose the forelimbs. All right, it's beer 30. Oh, game.
Just on your shoulder.
And I didn't put your slide up, by the way, as you could tell.
Yes, you did show it in molecular biology figure in some disparaging way.
No, the molecular phylogeny wasn't disparaged in the least. It was the language of certainty, absolute truth, that if you want to know what I'm disparaging.
This is an interesting development coming out of the Thousand Plant project that I've been leading. There's 2 papers very...
You sequenced a flowerpot snake. Oh, yeah, no, it's okay.
More the general point is discrepancies in phylogenies, in this instance computed from the molecular data. And it's an interesting development, at least among the plant molecular systemicists, or biologists, what do you want to call them, that they've gotten surprisingly little pushback, is that now that we've generated a ridiculous amount of data, and certain things are still unresolvable, it's not just discrepancy between trees based on nuclear genes versus, say, plastids, or different nuclear genes. Is that there's certain plays, a certain area of tree that simply are not getting resolved. They're just continual discord, no matter how you look at it. And so the community is slowly accepting the idea that there may be certain regions of the tree, at least in the plant world, that will never be resolvable, at least based on molecular data. There is internal argument within my consortium over whether that's true or, in the absolute sense, that there may not ever be resolution on these phylogenetic questions. There's actually, I think, in terms of the phylogeny, the plant was probably the first to actually come to this away from a conclusion that it's a lost cause. It's an interesting point. And so if you're going to dispute discrepancy between the molecular records versus the fossil, at least within the plant world, the molecular people are starting to concede that maybe it's a lost cause, period, at least in certain slates.
Well, I would argue that absolute truth is a lost cause. But that's the beauty of a hypothesis. It's open to conjecture and refutation, testing and falsification, and that's the whole point of it. And the good thing, phylogenetically speaking, I think that's the elegant concept behind the notion of a sister group. It's not an absolute statement about ancestry. It's a statement about relative relationship. And so while the golden arrow of the complete genome may not provide the answer in plant systematics, and I'm looking at Jocelyn every time I say that, while that golden arrow may in fact prove to be hollow, at least the relative hypothesis remains, which is what we're here to do, right? Who needs absolute truth?
Whether or not even that exists, that's actually a big argument within the group. There's 2 separate issues. One is, can you reconstruct the biology based on any amount of infinite or, up to 100% of the molecular data you can possibly collect? And people are starting to include and get complete data, whatever the hell that might mean, and it still can't be computed. That's one question. The other question, which some of the more extreme people are arguing, is that it doesn't even exist. Even take all your fossils, you know, and that gets to certain issues about how evolution might work. So I just wanted to alert you. There's this growing realization, I wouldn't say realization, at least it's movement, if you like, at least within the planet, on the futility of some of these exercises.
Well, on that futility note, the bar is open. And thank you for coming.
Good job.